Dr. John Hanks, you are an international consultant in the area of wildlife conservation, wildlife crime areas, with a very long record in being directly involved in the management of wildlife in southern African countries, being in charge of protected areas, etc. In your presentation, you motivated very strongly for the legalization of trade in rhino horn. Won't you summarize your views on that to give us an idea what your key points are?
Well, I'm strongly committed to motivating for a legal trade in rhino horn because I believe we have a huge problem in Africa at the moment. The cost of protecting rhinos is going up, and the pressure on conservation agencies to find the funds to look after these animals is almost unprecedented in the history of conservation in Africa. And I look at Kruger National Park today, where they're making an enormous investment in trying to curb rhino poaching. The army is there. Howard Buffett has donated huge amounts of money from overseas. So many NGOs are pouring money in. There's an army of unmanned surveillance vehicles flying around. The park has 1 million visitors a year, and yet they still cannot stop poaching. And in the first 4 months of this year, it went up by 18%. That's an 18% increase after last year, and there are fewer rhinos there. So you have to ask the question, how are we going to fund this? And my other concern is that the private landowners in South Africa, who today look after some 25% of all the continent's rhinos, are finding it extremely difficult to do this. Their costs are going up. Some of them are paying up to 150,000 rand a month to look after the rhinos they have on their property. And this is not sustainable. They can't afford this, and they're saying we're going to have to get rid of them because we get no income from them. Now, the whole idea of a legal trade in rhino horn is that you don't have to kill a single animal. The poachers, when they come in, they shoot the animal, they cut off the horn, and they run, and the animal dies, if it's not dead already when it's shot. And that is a terrible waste of a resource. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that if you cut off the horn clearly above the skin line and do it cleanly in an immobilized animal, the horn will grow again. And it will grow again at the rate of about 1 kilogram a year in males, about 600 grams a year in females. That's a lot of horn. And remember that a horn is worth about $64,000 US. One of those 1 kilogram of horn. That's a lot of money. Now, this is money that can go back to the people who are looking after the rhinos. And I've been told time after time that if there was a legal trade, many more people would take on rhinos. At the moment, they don't want to do it. Now, this, of course, is not going to happen unless there is a 2/3 majority at the next conference of the Party of CITES.
One of the presenters at the seminar was of the view that at next year's CITES meeting, the chances of a proposal to legalize trades passing with support of member states is virtually zero. Do you have a view on that?
I think this will be the case if South Africa decides not to take the lead in motivating for illegal trade. A decision hasn't been made. A committee of experts is obviously going to be advising the minister on this. But should the minister agree that this is something that South Africa should take on, I think the next task is to have an active advocacy campaign in what we call the rhino range states, those countries that have rhinos. And you could start by presenting the case for a legal trade to each of those countries and say, look, don't get rid of your stockpiles, release them gradually into the market. As animals die, put those horns into the market. This has to be done, though, in a very, very controlled way. And the motivation for this is to set up what's called a central selling organization. Nothing is, of course, foolproof. Everything is open to corruption. But this is by far and away the best way to do this, because it means that any horn that is sold, presumably to China and to traditional medicinal uses, has to go through this process. The advantages of that is that the money from the sale goes back to the people who are looking after them, and that runs into millions a year. The second advantage is the government at this end gets tax from it, so the government's going to be interested in supporting this. When it gets to the far end at China, if China has signed into this system, then the Chinese government gets tax revenue from it as well. And they're going to be particularly interested in keeping illegally harvested horn out of this process. I believe it can work. But at present, unless we have an advocacy campaign and get the states in Africa that have rhinos on their land to agree to this, it won't happen. Now, imagine going to the Conference of the Parties if those countries that have rhinos all come together and say, we want a legal trade. How can the outside world say you can't do it?
You stressed the words realism and sustainability quite often in your presentation.
Yes.
What lies behind that?
Well, I do that because I think a lot of well-intentioned people have come up with all sorts of different ideas to deal with the trade. But I say to everyone, is it really going to work in the time we have, and is it sustainable? And if you look at the amount of money that's required now to boost field protection with poaching demand going up, that most certainly isn't sustainable. I think there's donor fatigue stepping in. People are tired of being asked for money for rhinos all the time. And the most important point is, it's not necessary to ask for money because the animals can actually pay for themselves. And I'm particularly concerned that we're losing sight of the priorities in conservation. There's so much emphasis on rhinos, so much money going into rhino conservation, that we're losing sight of such key things as managing our water catchment areas, conserving biodiversity in general, soil, microorganisms, pollinators. These are the real key issues, particularly in developing countries in Africa. Now, you have to ask the question, is it fair to ask the government, say, of South Africa, to put millions more into conserving a single species when the country has enormous priorities for social development? Every time you go into a room, you look around, you think, when are the lights going out? The load shedding factor here is a real concern. Top priority for government is to sort out Eskom, so we have a regular supply of power. Other priorities is to sort out service delivery process activities, and also to sort out xenophobic violence, which is having a big impact on tourism. That must come top of the list. Rhino conservation, yes, of course, it's good to have it, but to put millions of money in from the government when these animals can pay for themselves, it doesn't make sense to me.
One of the key speakers in last night's session of the seminar, Professor Nadal, threw out a challenge to his detractors. He argued against the legalization of trade. His challenge was, come up with a rebuttal of my arguments relating to the economic viability of legal trade. Now, I know you're not an economist, but what is your response to that challenge?
I'm not an economist, I'm a dumb zoologist, I'm afraid, and some of the arguments he put forward were way over my head. But I've talked to a lot of very well qualified and highly experienced resource economists who can answer him. And it was a pity, in a way, that the main speaker on the economic aspects at this conference was a person from Mexico who really has very little experience of African conditions. It's not saying he's not a competent academic. I'm not qualified to judge that. But by golly, when I look around at the people who have spent many years working on trade economic issues in this country, Professor Brian Child is one, Mike Eustace is another, Mike Sass-Rolfs, another person who's now doing a PhD at Oxford. All of them are qualified to speak out on the issues and could counteract the arguments Professor Nadal put forward much better than I can. But even if I agree with him, we don't have all the answers on the trade at this stage. But by golly, if we continue doing what we're doing now, there won't be any rhinos left. What is wrong with trying out a legal trade for a 3 or 4 year period? I can't see we're going to lose anything.
The debates in this seminar have varied from policy changes, trade, yes or no, enhanced law enforcement, release the stockpiles. Do you have a sort of a preference, a priority of which approach is most likely to curb poaching, protect wildlife, including rhino?
Well, I think without a shadow of doubt, we've got to continue with field protection activities. There's no two ways about that. And I said that in my presentation, that those who advocate illegal trade in rhino horn believe very strongly that field protection must continue, obviously. But the other thing that wasn't really mentioned enough is, who are the people driving the trade? Who are the people who are going into Mozambique with a fistful of rands or dollars and saying to the poachers, go and get me a rhino? What are the other individuals up in the trade? That can be disrupted. And of course, it's very, very difficult to do that. It's an operation that I tried to get involved in right back in 1987, a controversial initiative called Operation Knock, which is the subject of a book that I've just published 2 weeks ago. And that deals very closely with the difficulties of infiltrating the trade. It's a highly dangerous business. You start doing that and you're likely to be killed. But these are ruthless criminals, and I don't say that lightly.
Do you see law enforcement at present being equipped and sufficiently resourced to provide a counter to the increased poaching activities?
I don't think it is in any country. I think everyone is having the same problems. You heard stories from Kenya of people who are caught with rhino horn being perhaps arrested, often getting off in court because the prosecution is not adequate, because of corruption in high places. There are examples throughout Africa of people being identified as being involved in the trade and nothing ever happens to them. And one classic example is that through this Operation Knock activity, we got irrefutable evidence that the embassy of North Korea was taking rhino horn out of Africa in a diplomatic bag. Now, as you probably know, a diplomatic bag can be a briefcase or a shipping container, and it cannot be opened, it just goes through. We handed over this information to the head of police in Zimbabwe, and he said he would look into it. And about 3 days later, he was told to drop the case. Why? Because the North Koreans came in and they helped Mugabe when they had the Matibili massacre, when about 20 to 30,000 of his own people were killed. Now that shows the difficulties you have. You expose what is happening, but because of all sorts of high-level connections, it gets thrown out. How do you manage that? And that's a challenge we have to face.
Thanks very much.